Going to wait until.
Okay. You'd like to wait some more?
No, let's go.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Brown. I have the great pleasure this evening, albeit by Zoom, of having a conversation with the author of Klondikers, Dawson City's Stanley Cup Challenge, and How a Nation Fell in Love with Hockey. That author, of course, is Tim Falconer. But before I go any further, I want to thank Ben McNally for once again being everyone's savior and being the bookseller on this launch. Thanks, Ben. Tim Falconer, of course, is well known to you, probably. He's one of Canada's most accomplished journalists. Before he became a journalist, he was an engineer. In fact, he first visited the Klondike when he had a summer job working in a Yukon mine. And I believe that moving from being an engineer to being a journalist, that's not just reverse engineering. That's actually a bad career move. But Tim has done very, very well as a journalist. He was a long time and much beloved and important teacher of journalism at Ryerson and at King's College, and also at the hyper prestigious Banff Literary Journalism program. He's been a resident in the coveted Burton House Writers Retreat in Dawson City. He's an expert canoeist on Yukon rivers, and of course he is as you know, a first-rate writer. His previous books include Bad Singer, The Surprising Silence of Tone Deafness and How We Hear Music, which made the Globe and Mail's top 100 list and was a finalist for the Lane Anderson Award. And perhaps more relevant to tonight, Tim lives and plays hockey in Toronto, but has saved himself the embarrassment of being a Leafs fan. He's now going to read a bit of his book to us, I believe via video. Take it away, Tim.
There should be a video coming up any second.
The Canadian Pacific Railway's Continental train was nearly 3 hours late when it pulled up to the station in Winnipeg. Given what the hockey players had been through since leaving the Klondike, this barely counted as a complication. After all, inconvenient forces had started conspiring against them even before they headed out of Dawson City. First, one of the team's stars decided to stay behind with his injured wife. Then the captain and most accomplished player realized he had to stay a little longer to work. He tried to catch up with the others as soon as he could. The team's luck did not improve once the journey began. Setting out to capture the Stanley Cup and the fame that went with it, the players figured it would be a straightforward 18-day trip. Straightforward by Yukon standards, anyway. 3 left on foot on December 18, 1904. 4 others followed on bikes the next day, though they all eventually abandoned their wheels. After 330 miles, the team arrived in Whitehorse 2 days after Christmas, only to watch a blizzard shut down the narrow-gauge trains on the White Pass and Yukon Route Railway. When they finally reached Skagway, Alaska, they'd missed their steamer to Vancouver by 2 hours and had to wait to board a Seattle-bound ship for a voyage that left the players severely seasick. They believed the hardship was worth it. Since 1893, the reward for being Canada's best amateur team was the Dominion Hockey Challenge Cup, a silver bowl donated by Lord Stanley of Preston, the Governor General at the time. Known from the beginning as the Stanley Cup, it quickly became the most prestigious trophy in the land. While the trustees wouldn't allow just any team to contend for the honor, they did approve a challenge from Dawson City's All-Stars. To win the cup, the Yukoners would have to defeat the formidable Ottawa Hockey Club, a team known in lore as the Silver Seven, and the sport's original superstar, One-Eyed Frank McGee. Few hockey people considered the Klondikers a serious threat. The team was from a small subarctic town, and no squad from west of Brandon had yet challenged for the Cup, let alone won it. When accepting the challenge, Ottawa insisted the Dawson team not play any exhibition games en route. Rather than an attempt to ensure their opponents would arrive unprepared, this was to avoid any losses to weaker teams that might discourage ticket sales for the Cup Series. The original plan, as set out by Joe Boyle, the brass businessman managing the tour, was for a layover in Winnipeg to do some training. But the team was so far behind schedule, that was no longer an option. With just a 2-hour stop before continuing on to Ottawa, the players didn't have enough time to do much more than stretch their legs and assure reporters their challenge was no joke. Despite the team's lack of star power, the cross-country track charmed Canadians. Though the codified version of the sport was only 3 decades old, passion for hockey had swept the nation since Lord Stanley had donated the Cup and was only intensifying. But there was more to the enthusiasm for the underdogs from the Yukon than a love of the game. The Klondike Gold Rush was over, but people continued to romanticize the North, and the long journey from that faraway land to the nation's capital fit into that mystique. All along the route, fans cheered the Yukon team. And it was no different in the home of the champions, where the Citizen reported, "The matches are creating the greatest interest of any Stanley Cup contest yet played in Ottawa." At 4:45 on January 11, 1905, 3.5 weeks after leaving Dawson City, the hockey players stepped off the train and onto the platform at Ottawa Central Station, where a large and appreciative crowd gave them a right hearty reception. Bob Shillington, the manager of the cup-holding team, and other club executives led the players away to the Russell House. A throng overflowed the hotel's rotunda in hopes of catching a glimpse of the exotic visitors. But the cordial welcome didn't mean the hosts were about to grant Dawson's request for a 1-week postponement before starting the best-of-3 series. Meanwhile, the challengers denied a newspaper report that they default on the series opener and focus on the second and third matches rather than play unprepared. The first game would go ahead as scheduled, with Earl Grey, the new Governor General, facing the puck at 8:30 p.m. on Friday the 13th. After nearly a month on the road, the exhausted and far from game-shaped Klondikers would take on the reigning Stanley Cup champions before a sellout crowd of 2,500 fans at Day's Rink in just over 48 hours.
That's great. That reads as well as you read it out loud as well as it reads. So congratulations, first of all. I notice, I have to say, that it contains arguments in favor of both high salaries and violent play, which immediately explained why you're a Boston fan.
Well, okay. I should clarify. I mean, that's a clever opening question, Ian, but it's not really true to say that I'm in favor of violence. I do try to show in the book that violence was a part of the game from the very beginning. High salaries isn't, I'm not necessarily in favor of high salaries. I'm in favor of players getting paid, which people like John Ross Robertson fought mightily to make sure they didn't get paid. And to me, this was ridiculous because everybody else was making money, including someone like John Ross Robertson, who was the publisher of the Toronto Telegram, who made money selling newspapers to hockey fans and selling ads to equipment makers and rink owners and whatnot. So everybody was making money except for the only people who were essential to the whole enterprise, the hockey players.
Yeah. Well, I want to come back to both those subjects, and I did just use them as a prop. Those 2 points to prop to dig at your faith in Boston, but it really is.
I knew that was coming.
There's a lot of reporting on this. And I do recall a couple of years ago when you first started on this book, you were very worried about being able to find enough detail. And you said, how will I ever find out about the lives of all these people who lived over a century ago? You obviously solved that problem. I mean, this is a book full of footnotes and notes and beautifully researched. What happened? You must have discovered something.
This is my fifth book, but the first time I've done historical nonfiction, and I'm used to writing things where I can just call someone up and say, please explain this to me. And I was quite naive. I thought, oh, well, there will be diaries and letters of all the players. This will be easy. Of course, if there were diaries and letters, someone else would have written this book already. So I got to the point where I had too much to give up, but I didn't have enough to keep going. And then I read about in 1896 when they started to do play-by-play by telegram, and people would meet in hotel lobbies and theaters, outside telegraph offices and whatnot. And someone would read out each play that would come, like there would be a telegraph operator and usually like a hockey fan or expert sitting beside him. And he would type out the play-by-play. And as soon as I read that, it was like, okay, I know how to do this book, because it made me realize how quickly Canada fell in love with hockey. I mean, I always thought, okay, we've always loved hockey, or it happened slowly over generations. It really happened very, very quickly. From, in 1893, the cup comes. Stanley says he's going to donate it in 82, but he, for some reason, orders it from England, and it arrives in 83. By 1905, so 12 years later, when Dawson plays, the country is obsessed with the game. So it really was sort of love at first sight.
Yeah, no, I was astonished at how non-existent hockey was, around confederations. I mean, how quickly it grows, and it really starts out as an amateur game, at least organized spectator hockey. I don't know what other term to use for it, as an amateur game I think in around 1875, somewhere around in Montreal. But what was the role of athletics back then? What role did it play in the culture?
Well, the interesting thing is athletic clubs were originally almost as much social as athletic. So like the sort of the first one in Canada was a curling one, and people would curl on the St. Lawrence River, and then go to a pub, and the losers would buy the meal. And then other sports started to develop their clubs, and then the Montreal Amateur Athletic Association started, and then clubs across the country started to follow that lead. And so originally these were wealthy people, business people, shop owners, but not landed gentry, because they were in their own little enclave, but these were middle to upper middle class people. And they were the ones with the money and the leisure time to take part in sports, where the working man, had to work probably 6 or 7 days a week, and they didn't have a lot of time to do this. And so this is where, it starts off as an amateur sport, as all sports did. And hockey, because it was so new, was slower to get professionals. Like baseball in the States had professionals in the 1870s, and then boxing was going through its own thing. Ned Hanlon, the sculler, went pro. But, hockey and lacrosse, which were the two big Canadian sports near the end of the 1800s, were slower to get professionalism, and lacrosse got it first, because the powers that be were so against amateurism. It was all done under the table, and they would slip someone a gold coin, or give someone a job, or, this was how they got around it.
Well, where did this obsession with amateurism, just as a quick aside, come from? I mean, you write about the crisis of manliness. Are those two related?
Yes. Okay. So it's all basically this Victorian ideology, or I like to call it Victorian dogma. But it was, originally amateur codes were, you basically had to be a rich white man, because some of them specifically, well, there's no way if you're a woman you could be part of a club. If you were from another race, no chance. And a lot of clubs had no artisans, no laborers rules. They never talked about this, but one of the advantages of that is they didn't have to worry about someone who was stronger and fitter because he was working all the time, being a better player than them. But so it really, it comes out of a very classist, racist, sexist attitude, of trying to keep it within their class. And the crisis of manlyhood was connected because it was also part of this Victorian idea that as men started to move from working in factories to working in offices, or not working on the farm but then working in factories and offices, that they weren't around their sons anymore. And people feared that there was a feminization of young men. And this all connected to this whole idea of, the wars are won on the fields of Eton and this kind of thing. And they had to make young men strong and competitive and be good soldiers. Basically, they were raising the next generation of soldiers. So that's where this comes out of. And Canada, particularly Ontario, was very, very monarchist, very, Anglophile. And people like John Ross Robertson were completely insane about it. So even as other people were starting to loosen up a bit, he kind of doubled down.
So, and this is why other hockey cities, Winnipeg, for instance, Ottawa, Montreal, and Montreal, of course, having a monopoly on the cup for nearly a decade. That's why they all thought Toronto basically sucked at hockey. I mean, nothing changes, I guess. But
yeah, so hockey came to Toronto later than Montreal and Ottawa and even Kingston. There wasn't really even any organized hockey until 1890. And so they got a slower start. They also tended to play a bit of a tamer game than the rest of the country. But really professional players didn't, and it was all under the table for another 15 years. But the Ontario Hockey Association, particularly under John Ross Robertson, but even before him, really fought hard. Like if you even played in another sport or competed in another sport against a professional, you were banned from the OHA. So if you went in a skating race and you didn't even take any money, but someone else in the race did, you were banned. Or eventually they said, well, anyone who plays lacrosse can't play in the OHA because lacrosse allowed some pro players. So Ontario, okay, so Toronto and the OHA, so Ottawa was not part of the OHA. It was originally, but they got mad and left. And Kenora, which was originally called Rat Portage, which was part of the Manitoba League. But the Ontario Hockey Association didn't win the cup. No team from Toronto won the cup till 1914, when a professional team, the Blue Shirts, won it. So, and yeah, the first decade, Montreal owned the cup, except for Winnipeg won it a couple of times, and then finally Ottawa won it, and they only kept it 3 years, but they won it and defended it 10 times, which is really remarkable.
Yeah. How different was the game as played then uh, uh, from the game we watch today? Because as I was reading, I mean, I'm just the skates with springs, and there seems to be 9 or 7 players on the team, and the goalie's not allowed to go down, and there's no corners, and there's only 2 periods, so everybody's kind of pacing themselves. It sounds like a radically different game.
In many ways, and yes, you mentioned some of the differences. There were 7 players. The defensemen lined up one in front of the other. They were called the cover point and the point. And the 7th player was a rover who was sort of 4th forward. He was, I like to think of him as sort of a Patrice Bergeron player. He was part of the offense, but he was really good at joining the defense. And as you mentioned, the goalies couldn't go down. There were no substitutions, so they had to pace themselves. The equipment wasn't as good, obviously. The ice, it was all natural ice. So you get a warm spell, and they're skating around in the water. But in many ways, a lot of the DNA of the game stayed the same. Like the play through injuries code that is still part of the game. And that comes from, there were no substitutions. So if you were injured, you had to keep playing for your teammates. The violence in the game, which right from the beginning, and even superstition, which we always think about how superstitious hockey players are. And that goes right from the beginning of the game. So yeah, if we got teleported back to that time, yeah, I think we would say this is a very different game, but in a lot of ways it's the same.
Yeah. So talk to me a little more about violence. As you say, there was I think in your book you say that there was a fight that broke out in the very first game that was ever played on a amateur pro spectator level. I think it broke out amongst the spectators, didn't it?
Yeah.
Some
So
kid
okay,
got hit.
I'll just want to clarify. So the where hockey started, there's a big fight, and who knows where. The earliest reference to is actually in a letter that John Franklin wrote in 1825, and they were stuck in Delaney, which is now in Northwest Territories, and he talked about his men playing hockey on ice, and that's the first recorded. But when we talk about the modern game, we're talking about March 3rd, 1875, the first indoor game, and that is the beginning of the modern game. And a fight breaks out between some kids get on the ice before the game is over, and a kid gets hit, and then a father. So yeah, it's sort of it wasn't a sort of between 2 players. It was between a player and a father and a kid and whatnot. But yes, there was a fight in the first game. And then lots of fights. And this is the other thing about, the whole thing about the amateur code is, we're gentlemen, and they were just as dirty. They fought just as much. They cheated just as much. They didn't pay their debts. There was no evidence that pros were any worse at any of those things than amateurs.
Yeah, you do a beautiful job of pricking the that overinflated balloon of amateurism, and it's what I think makes the book especially original. Do you think that Lord Stanley, the Governor General who commissioned the cup, do you think he was a hockey fan?
Yeah.
But
oh yeah.
Was he just a hockey fan, or did he understand or have some vision that this cup was actually going to somehow help unite this geographically distant country?
I think it would be giving him too much prescience to think it could be that much. I mean, I don't think they had any idea the game was going to take off the way it did. He doesn't put the word amateur in his, 5 conditions for the cup, but it was clear that that's what he wanted to do. In his wording, he's talking about amateur ideals. but yeah, they had no idea that it was going to be. So he names two trustees. One is P.D. Ross, who's the publisher of the Ottawa Journal, and another guy's a guy named John Sweetland. Ross was the real hockey guy and was sort of the lead trustee, but they had no idea what they were getting into when they said yes. You know, P.D. Ross was a very civic-minded guy, and he said, "Sure, I'll do that." But it soon became just this massive headache for him because teams were squabbling. They couldn't agree on referees. They couldn't agree on how many games to play. You know, it became. And in fact, he did try to give up the job a couple of times and tried to get the leagues to take it over, and they wouldn't, or they couldn't agree amongst themselves. So he was kind of stuck with it.
There are a lot of, great characters in this book, many of them up in Dawson, but a lot of them don't start there. Did you, as you were writing, develop a favorite?
Well, sort of like your children, I guess you like them all. I mean, he's only a minor character, but Swiftwater Bill Gates is, just such a fabulous Dawson character. I mean, I really like Will the Young, and he's a great character because he's flawed in a lot of ways. P.D. Ross was, it was really cool learning about him because he was, I think, quite a remarkable man, and we don't really know much about him, but he was, a great newspaper publisher on top of his hockey stuff. But even he, so he's a trustee of the Cup, and he's heavily involved in the Ottawa Hockey Club. And it's like back then they didn't worry about a conflict of interest like that. Joe Boyle, who's the manager of the team, great character. And after the book, he goes on to be this renegade war hero. The Canadian government tries to disassociate themselves from him, but he goes on. He became known as the savior of Romania, and he was, most people believe the paramour of Queen Marie of Romania. So, he had this remarkable life before the Yukon, in the Yukon, and then afterwards. And he's this great Canadian hero that nobody knows anything about. I mean, there's a couple of biographies of him that are out of print. I know there's a guy in Whitehorse who's working on a film about him, and I hope a lot of people will see that.
It's so interesting because, the cliche, of course, is that the jock is not an interesting person, not smart, blah, blah, blah. But all these people are clearly self-generating, full of energy, wild ideas. Let's talk a little bit about Dawson City, if you don't mind. So people can challenge. The Stanley Cup is a challenge cup. People can challenge for the cup. Dawson City challenges for the cup. How did they get the idea that they were good enough to do that?
Okay, I think there are two things here. One is, if you're the kind of person who will leave your life in the East behind or wherever and go up to Dawson, if you go during the original rush, you're climbing the Chilkoot Pass or the White Pass, which is a mind-boggling physical experience to begin with, and you've left your life behind to go live on the subarctic, and you have this idea that you can do anything, that nothing can stop you, and you're also a dreamer, right? You dream big, and you think, well, I can reach that dream. I think the other thing was they were so far away from the rest of the country. They didn't know how much hockey was changing, how much better the players were becoming, and how strategy was beginning to get into the game. So they were a bit oblivious to how really they shouldn't have challenged for the cup. I mean, and P.D. Ross should never have approved it. And Ottawa, I think they just thought, oh, this will sell a lot of tickets. It's like, oh, these people from the Klondike are going to come and will fill the rink. And so that's why they did it. I mean, it's interesting.
Yeah.
One of the conditions was Dawson couldn't play any exhibition games because originally they thought, well, we'll play some games in Winnipeg and whatnot along the way. And Dawson said no, not because they wanted to make sure that players were out of shape when they arrived, but if there were any embarrassing losses, that might hurt ticket sales in Ottawa.
Oh, so it was a money call.
Yeah.
All along. Yeah.
Yeah.
But before they can get there, to take on a team that's much better than them. Well, before we get to that, let me ask you something else. So this is where scientific hockey comes in. This phrase you use when you say that in the centers in Ottawa, in Montreal, to a lesser degree in Toronto and Winnipeg, and down in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, the game is getting better. So what's happening to make the game better at that point?
So in 1899, the Montreal Shamrocks win the cup. And they played what they called scientific hockey. Now, you or I would call that strategic hockey, but it was a big buzzword in business to call everything scientific. And it basically just was much more passing, because originally the game was a lot more individual efforts, but they had what they call combination plays, which was basically passing, and much more positional play. So when they won the cup, and even as today, a team wins the cup, and then all the other teams say, "Oh, we have to play like that." So, and also it was just it was a more beautiful, more talented, more exciting brand of hockey. So, and that's what the guys in Dawson were kind of oblivious to.
Right. So they're oblivious to it, but they decide to challenge anyway. But then they have to get to the game. And I mean, the story of their journey is, I don't know whether I'm reading the script to a movie like After Hours or because it's so unbelievable, the stuff that keeps happening to them. I mean, just the idea. I mean, how did they decide that some of them decide to walk the first leg, which means 350 miles, so that they can then catch the train to Skagway? I mean, a 350-mile walk, is that the sort of thing that people in Dawson just toss off?
Yes. Well, it's actually 330, but that's just a minor correction here. So there were stage coaches, and when there was enough snow, sleighs, horse-drawn, but they were $125 for the trip. So, if there were 8 players, that's $1,000. So they were saying that they were going to walk to keep in shape. This was their line. I suspect it was to save money. I think they might have planned to take a dog sled for their gear, but they didn't because there wasn't enough snow. And when I was growing up and I would read about this story, they always said they took dog sleds. I think the confusion comes from miners used to call a long walk a mush. And so they would talk about the team mushed from Dawson to Whitehorse. They didn't take dog sleds, they walked. Anyway, that's a matter. So on December 18th, 1904, 3 of them walk out of town on the Overland Trail. The next day, 4 leave on bikes. Now, none of the bikes make it all the way. They either broke down, or the last couple of days, they started to get like a ton of snow. But everybody made it. 2 days after Christmas, everybody was in Whitehorse. And then, you think, okay, that's the hardest part. We're easy here. There had been so much snow that there were snow slides, and the train, which is only 110 miles from Whitehorse to Skagway, is closed. So they wire the ship they're supposed to take and say, wait for us. And the ship waits 24 hours and leaves 2 hours before they get there. So they're stuck in Skagway for several days. And, they might have used this to do some training. There was a rink that was half sand and dulled their skates, so they didn't really practice. And I know that some of the players were non-drinkers on the team, but one of the legends is that they were in heavy liver training while they were in Skagway. When they finally get on the steamer, then they all get seasick. And yeah, it just seems like a journey from hell.
Oh, it is a journey from hell, or to hell. One, as it turns out. Do you think if one of the guys who just gets completely, waylaid for any number of reasons, he actually stops to see somebody, I think in Winnipeg, is Weldy Young. Do you think if Weldy Young hadn't been held up in maybe Skagway as well as in Winnipeg, and he was their best player, yeah, by a long shot, do you think they might have stood a chance against one-eyed Frank McGee and the team if he'd made it to play?
I think they would have been better. They wouldn't have embarrassed themselves, but I don't think they could have beat Ottawa. I think Ottawa was just such a good collection of players, and with that superstar one-eyed Frank McGee. But yeah, there's no question. And Weldy Young joins them for most of their tour after the series. And on the tour, they don't do too badly. I think they win 10 and lose 12. So, they're almost 500. They don't embarrass themselves on the tour. But they weren't playing the best team in the country.
Yeah. Yeah. I meant to say before we began that you can put your questions into the Q&A box on the screen. So if you have questions, please do that. I have, before we turn to questions, I have one more for you. The irony of all of this is that you spend a lot of time making, as I say, this original and I think very strong argument against this pretense of amateurism, and that it's a put-up job. It's a way of distracting attention from really deplorable, from wanting a closed shop, a racially and culturally closed and gender closed shop. But the weird thing is that everybody who will read your book, and I hope everybody will, they will fall in love with the Klondike team. They will fall in love with the Klondike team precisely because they are not professionals, because they start walking to Toronto from the Klondike. They miss the train. They do this, that they lose one of the games by whatever it was, 10 to 2, 12 to, it was just like complete routes. But
23 to 2.
Because sorry, yeah. So, but because they are amateurs, they have that sort of what the Italians call sprezzatura that everybody always talks about when they talk about amateurism, a kind of gifted love of the game. We admire them because they're amateurs. But
yeah, absolutely.
As you say, they should never have been in the game. Sorry, what were we going to say?
I totally get that take, but also don't forget that they were doing a barnstorming tour after the Ottawa series to make money. At least they wanted to make enough money to get back to Dawson. And that's why the OHA teams wouldn't play the Dawson team on that tour, because they considered them professionals. So, and I also dispute that you have to be an amateur to love the game. Does Sidney Crosby love the game any less because he makes millions of dollars? I don't think so.
So why does this issue persist then? As you've pointed out, as you've discovered, it was there right at the beginning of the game, and it's still there. People are still moaning and groaning about the amount of money the player who they think isn't worth it, blah, 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 has played. Half the, you've heard that.
Well, okay, but for people of our generation, we grew up with, Father Bauer and, his amateur flying fathers and the Olympics. And, so basically Canada couldn't compete in hockey in the Olympics for decades because the Russian Red Army, who were basically all professionals, were called amateurs. And we had to send a bunch of college kids who would get creamed while the best players in the world were playing in the NHL. I have nothing against Father Bauer and the Flying Fathers, but come on, we were just, sold this bill of goods when we were kids that amateurism, that's the way it should be. And it was, I don't know. I just think it's unfair that the people who provide the entertainment are the ones who should get paid.
You know, Canada is often accused of being not opportunistic enough, certainly not as opportunistic as the Americans, that this has given us a less vigorous economy. It has given us a less aggressive culture. And there are a lot of people who like that. But do you think there's any connection between that willingness to buy into empire, into imperialism, into the values of a dominant culture? It affected hockey. Do you think it spread into the rest of the culture?
I think it did. I mean, I think that monarchy is not as important now as it was. But yeah, I mean, I think for many, many decades, Canada, I mean, until 1947, Canadians were British citizens, technically, until the Canadian Citizenship Act in 1947. You know, and there are still parts of this country where, you know, the British Empire is still an important thing. But of course, the American Empire is a pretty important thing in Canada too. I mean, I like to think the guys from Dawson were much more of the entrepreneurial spirit type.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One last question. You know, you're a hockey player. You're a pretty good hockey player. How would you?
So there's some people I play hockey with who are on this who are laughing right now.
But well, the guys you play with, then, how would they have fared against these early teams? Would they have been able to hold their own? Dawson, or possibly even Ottawa?
I think some of them, like my Friday afternoon game, it's a pretty high level, and there's a guy who played pro in Europe and some guys who played college hockey. I mean, aside from the age difference, given that the equipment changes and the training and whatnot, you know, let's face it, in those days, Canada was a small country. There was a small pool to pick from. And so it was a lot easier to be a great hockey player compared to everyone else. And now so many people play hockey, you have to be really, really good to be really good. So, but yeah, I mean, I just think that the game has developed to such an extent that the better players that I play with, but yeah, would have no problem against these guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, look, you know, it's you are a pro, and it's a great.
But I don't get
book,
paid.
Well, I was going to say, you know, as two writers, I mean, if we're going to talk about not being insufficiently paid, we could go on and on about that for a long time. But it's a great book, and thank you for that. And I urge everybody to buy it. You know, Christmas is coming, and you know, I wasn't asked to say this, but this book, for that hard to buy person, perfect. You know, I would buy 3 copies myself if I were you, and you know, hand them around at Christmas time.
Thank you.
So anyway, we're going to go to questions now. If one of us can figure out how to do that, Q&A. Here we go. Okay. Did your experience? This is an anonymous attendee. That doesn't sound good, Tim. Anonymous attendee. That sounds like somebody who's got it in for you. Did your experience at Upper Canada College inform the writing, especially on the level of gentlemen must be amateur sportsmen?
Well, I guess in the sense that I saw through the bullshit, it did. That, you know, that I knew that a lot of the stuff people talk about, you know, their words and their actions didn't meet. up a lot.
Oh. Anonymous attendee. So it's same question. What, if any, specific superstitions did the Klondikers hold?
Well, it wasn't so much the Klondikers, and in fact, Weldy Young was in a group called the 13 Club, which they did everything to, they would sit 13 at a table and they would book rooms with 13 in them and buy lottery tickets with 13 in them, and so they were against that. But a lot of players were superstitious, and one of the stories I tell in the book is in 1902, the Montreal Hockey Club goes to Winnipeg to try to win the cup. And Montreal Hockey Club had been the best team from the beginning, like from the 1880s until they won the cup the first 2 years. Then the second year in 1894, they had a picture taken with 13 people, players and executives and whatnot. And then they didn't win anything else. And so all the fans are freaking out, they called that the hoodoo picture. He's like, no, you can't send 13 on this trip to Winnipeg. And fortunately, one of the spares couldn't go until a later train, a couple of days later. So only 12 went, and they ended up winning. So, I mean, this was the kind of level of superstition that that people had at that time. And I just find it so cool because, hockey players, especially goalies, are notoriously superstitious in hockey today.
From Michael Harper, Tim mentioned a turning point for the book. What was it? I believe it was the turning point in your research.
Oh, just when I read about how they did play-by-play by telegram, when they started doing that in 1896, then it sort of clued into the fact that Canada fell in love with hockey so quickly.
Ross Turnbull asks, having done a book about hockey of old, are you at all tempted to examine the contemporary game?
Well, never say never. I don't know what it would be, though. And, the problem with hockey players today is you just can't get access to them. There's a famous story in Toronto Life, I think in about the early 1980s. And they were talking about how, like in the 1960s, reporters and hockey players made about the same amount of money. So they were in the same class and they hang out together. Now a reporter makes, okay money, but the hockey players are making 10 million a year. So the hockey players treat them like dirt. And meanwhile, you've got the PR people who are, making sure, there's no bad publicity ever about the team. And so I think it's like I remember, and this goes back to the 80s, and I was talking to a writer and he had been contacted about doing an autobiography of Daryl Sittler. And he said it was impossible because Daryl Sittler wouldn't say anything bad about him. He wouldn't even say anything bad about Harold Ballard. I mean, so yeah, I would, but it'd have to be the right idea. But if anyone has any good ideas, let me know.
It does make you admire, the great hockey books, the ones that do work and that do manage to break through even more. J. Scott Tomlinson, I must be from Hawaii, I think, says, aloha, Tim. Do you love playing more than watching hockey, I presume? Mahalo.
Oh yeah. I love playing. I mean, I love to watch the Bruins too, but if given the choice, I'd play hockey anytime.
Yes. This allows me to ask anonymous attendees next question: why Boston? I have to say that's the best question somebody's asked so far.
Well, when I was about 6 years old, my parents put me in this kids hockey league, and all the teams were named after NHL teams. including the Montreal Maroons, who weren't even by the 1960s, weren't even around anymore. And I was put on the Boston Bruins. I was really bummed out that my best friend was put on the New York Rangers. And to sort of make, try to make me a little happier, my parents said, oh, well, there's a real team called Boston. Of course, this is when they were in sixth place out of six every year. But they were talking about this guy who was coming, this kid named Bobby Orr. And so I'm a loyal guy. I just stuck with them.
That's interesting. It's so, all of this stuff is so irrational at one level, so almost unconscious. It's really Seema Lowly, I'm probably mispronouncing that, asks, you've spent some significant time in Dawson City. Is this a narrative that comes up frequently in local folklore? And what inspired you to delve so deeply into this amazing story?
That's a really good question, because it doesn't come up much. And I asked friends of mine in Dawson, who've lived there, they're in their 60s and they lived their whole life. I said, did people talk about this when you were growing up? And they said, nope. Now, maybe if they had won the cup, well, I'm sure if they had won the cup, people would talk about it more. But if maybe it hadn't been such a humiliating loss, it would have been talked about more. But no, it wasn't. People don't talk about it much. Now, I know there's a guy who works in tourism in Dawson City, and he's working on some kind of display about the series. And in 1997, they did a recreation where a team from Dawson went by snowmobile and dog sled and whatnot. And they went and played the Ottawa alumni. And so some people know about it, but it's, so I don't know.
Sorry, is the did you uncover any unexpected archival evidence? This is from Ronald Debert.
Yeah. There were lots of things that surprised me. I was really surprised to find out that they've been talking about a cup challenge as early as 1900. And they actually issued an official challenge in 1901, but then didn't follow through. PD in the Library and Archives Canada, there's boxes and boxes of PD Ross's diaries, which was really helpful, but he didn't dish on anybody, which was sort of too bad. But there was no like mother lode. Sorry to keep using gold metaphors, but there was no mother lode where I went, oh my God, it was just lots of little things that I found in newspapers or in archives or whatever.
Nick Lewis 77 asks, what made Frank McGee such a great player? Who would you compare him to in today's game?
Well, I mean, the obvious comparison would be Connor McDavid, although I think he was tougher, so maybe a guy like Sidney Crosby. But he was a great goal scorer. He was tough. He could pass. He really was the best player at the time, and he just scored a remarkable amount. And so he was exciting to watch. He wasn't super big. I mean, they said he was sort of built like a horse. But he wasn't tall or there were guys who were taller and heavier. But
Tyler Ellis, these are great questions, by the way. You obviously have a much more intelligent readership than I do, because every time I've ever done one of these, the questions I get are, what kind of boots do you wear? Tyler Ellis is asking, would you rather be a great hockey player or a great singer? a reference to your last book.
Yeah, and I'll explain that Tyler Ellis is a friend of mine who helped me out quite a bit with my last book, and we did a bunch of shows together called Good Singer, Bad Singer, where he would play some music and I would talk about the book, and those were a lot of fun. Tyler, that's a really tough question. I would love to be both, but I think if I had to choose, I'd go with great hockey player. Although, you know what, when you think about it, if you're a great hockey player, you have a short career. If you're a great musician, you can do it your whole life. So let me think about that.
Alex Hutchinson, the great columnist, have you sent a copy of the book to Stephen Harper?
I have not.
Why
Do you think
not?
I should?
Oh, and if you don't sign in the flyleaf, I'd like to put something in the flyleaf.
Well, I feel like he should buy a copy. I think he's rich enough.
Did you admire his book? You quote it.
It's not. It's well researched. It's not the most exciting read. It's probably a lot like The Man Who Wrote It. I just hear my wife screaming in the background. I guess I shouldn't have said that.
Is a libel lawyer watching this? Could we get a ruling immediately, please? David Patterson asks, do any aspects of the amateur code carry on to your Friday Beer League?
We are a lot more gentlemanly than the amateurs of the era I write about in the book. So we support each other. Not that there isn't some violence, but it's the kind of violence where you shake hands and buy the guy a beer afterwards.
Alec Walsh asks, what is your favorite hockey book? And he says, congratulations, he looks forward to reading it. Do you have a single favorite? You've read a lot of stuff for this.
Oh, this is a bit of a cheat, but I think my favorite is a collection called Riding on the Roar of the Crowd. It's probably not in print anymore, but it's a collection of excerpts from different books and magazine articles and whatnot that I really love that. George Plimpton wrote a book called Open Net, which I really liked. Yeah, there's it's hard to pick one.
I just want to go back, if I could, to David Padden asks, can you describe what the Klondike, in quotes, was? Was it more of a real geographical place or more of a mythical place?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it was both. I mean, there's the Klondike. So Dawson is situated where the Klondike River meets the Yukon River. And all the gold-bearing creeks were tributaries of the Klondike. Or most of them were tributaries of the Klondike. So there was a region. And when they talk about 30,000 people in the Klondike during the gold rush in 1898, they weren't all in the town of Dawson. They were spread out on the creeks as well. But it's also very much a mythical place. That people imbued it with this sort of magic at the time, and I think still do. But I mean, you hear stories about people like a streetcar driver in Seattle or something stopped in the middle of his route and rushed off to the Klondike. I mean, they called it Klondikeitis, and people just went insane, and they went up there, and by the time they got there, there was no food. And most people didn't make it. Some people made it and turned around a few days later. if they stayed, they found out that all the good spots had been claimed. So there were, you had to go work for somebody else who owned a claim to, get any gold. But lots of people stayed, and some of them went and played hockey in Ottawa.
I once read that I think fewer than 5% of the people who went up there made any money. And I mean by that any money at all. It was a tiny, tiny percentage of people who actually succeeded at what they were doing and kept it.
Yeah, and a lot of the guys who made a lot of money spent it.
Mm-hmm.
So guys like Swiftwater, Bill Gates, he made a fortune, and then he worked very hard at spending it.
Are there any descendants of the Dawson team still in Dawson?
Not that I know of, and not that anybody I talked to in Dawson knew of.
And somebody here has asked, what kind of skates do you wear?
I wear tacks. I think they're tacks, are they? Why? What kind of question is that?
I don't know. What kind of skates do you wear? At least they're not like.
No, I guess they're Bauer.
And your bare feet.
My wife just yelled, "And my bare feet." Actually, I don't do that anymore. For 40 years, I didn't wear socks in my skates because Bobby Orr hadn't. But the skates I got now were so stiff, I had to start wearing socks.
What interests me is the skates you describe in the book, in the early games, and those early modern games in the 1890s. You're always talking about skates breaking, and you're always talking about there were springs on the skates. How did that?
Well, yeah. So originally they would attach to your boot, and then slowly tube skates started to come into the game. But yeah, originally it was, and I think most of the only hockey equipment the Dawson players took with them, because they had that long walk, was their skates, and they bought all their equipment, the rest of it, and their sweaters in Ottawa. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. The equipment has come along. Even from when I was a kid, the equipment has developed dramatically.
Well, you mentioned an early goalie, I believe, wearing cricket pads.
Yeah, George Merritt, who was the goalie on the Winnipeg Victorias, which was the first team outside of Montreal to win the cup, and he wore cricket pads, and nobody in the East had seen that before, but the goalie soon adopted it because it made a lot of sense.
Yeah, as you said, goalies are crazy. And then Paul Moore asks a question that a lot of people have asked in different form. The question as asked is, Tim, do you envision that this book could also become a movie or limited series on TV? And my bet is that yes, you do envision that. But have you had any offers?
I have not had any offers. I did have one producer ask for, when I was like, I gave him the sort of earlier draft before, when I'm still looking for all the errors, some of which I'm pretty sure I got. So he asked for it several months ago, and I haven't heard anything from him, but to me, it's a natural. I think it would have to be a fictionalized thing, because there isn't enough archival. There's no film. There's not a lot of great pictures. But I think you could do a fictionalized version of it that would be really entertaining and a great Canadian story.
Yeah. It sounds like the fame of the Dawson Ottawa Challenge did not spread to the US at all.
Well, I guess we'll find out. See how sales go there. Probably not. I mean, it was covered in the Canadian papers when they were traveling across the country, but probably in the American papers it wasn't a big deal.
What I think we have time for one last question. Did, and this is from Michael Harper again, did writing the book change your understanding and or appreciation for the game in any way?
Interesting. Well, yeah, when I talked about how some of the DNA of the game was there from the beginning, that was really interesting to me. And I think it, the game in a way mirrored how Canada was changing out of this colony to its own country. I mean, at this time, so cricket becomes less popular, American baseball becomes more popular. Rugby morphs into Canadian football, which is like American football. But the two biggest games were lacrosse, which was based on an Indigenous game, and hockey. So both of those were homegrown, and both of those were a lot less genteel than anything the British played. And so you can really start to see a different kind of nation. I know we always talk about Vimy Ridge as being, the beginning of Canadian nationhood, but obviously it wasn't just one event. And I think some of the beginnings is starting to happen around this time that hockey is becoming popular, and you see that in hockey. You see the changes, and professionalism, giving up on amateurism, and some of these things I think show how Canada was changing. So that was really, really fascinating to learn.
Well, I think it's 8:10. We've been at this for over an hour, which is our allotted time. Thank you, Tim, for taking the time, to talk, but most importantly, to write such a great book. I would like to thank Ben McNally again for being the superb bookseller that he is, and providing the books. And Klondikers is available wherever books are sold, but you can of course pick up not only a copy from Ben McNally Books, you can pick up a signed copy, which is bound to be a valuable thing to have on your shelf, especially when Falconer comes over for a beer. You'll and also an ECW Press, which is the publisher of the book, are also selling the book. But as I say, Ben McNally is the great place to go. Anyway, sorry to ramble on. Thanks again. Thanks, Tim. Thanks to everybody for watching and listening. The very first question in the Q&A was a guy named Dan Davidson, who said, "Greetings from Dawson City. The most I've ever seen at one of these was 56." and that number that number was passed some time ago on this Zoom. So anyway, thanks again, everybody. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you,
Good luck
Ian.
in